We've been led to believe that the secret sewing circle of Golden Age Hollywood, a clandestine network of unconventional actresses like Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich, was an elite club of freedom. But the truth is far darker. It was a bunker built on primal fear and hypocrisy, and there was only one woman who looked at these rules and tore them to shreds: Tallulah Bankhead. She didn't wear underwear, cursed like a sailor, and refused to hide her true self. For this honesty, the sewing circle despised her, and the studio system launched a cold-blooded operation. They didn't just fire a brilliant actress, they methodically turned her into a drunken joke. Today, we'll uncover the most cynical takedown in film history and discover what happens to a woman who refuses to wear a mask in a world of plastic illusions. Why did Hollywood let Marlene Dietrich wear men's suits and kiss women on screen, yet turn Tallulah Bankhead into a laughingstock for the same? The answer lies not in who they slept with, but in how they hid it. One played by the rules of hypocrisy. The other decided rules were for fools. History loves to sanitize dangerous women. When we hear about the sewing circle today, that underground network of lesbians and bisexuals from Hollywood's golden age, we want to see romance in it. We imagine a secret elite club where top stars could be themselves safely. We paint a pretty picture of female solidarity against a brutal patriarchy. But the reality was far more frightening and cynical. The sewing circle wasn't a club of freedom. It was a bunker of fear. A survival mechanism built on one simple rule: do whatever you want behind closed doors, but in public, play the role we sold you. And there was only one woman who looked at this contract and ripped it to pieces: Tallulah Bankhead. You've probably seen her photos or heard the famous raspy, "Darling." You might know her as the eccentric party girl people said. A day without Tallulah is like a month without a disaster. But that happy drunk image, that's not quite the truth. It's a prison cell the studio system built for her. In the next few minutes, we'll do what Hollywood tried to prevent for half a century. We'll dissect the real case of Tallulah Bankhead. We won't dig through dirty laundry, there was plenty, and it doesn't matter. We'll expose the industry's mechanics. You'll understand why the sewing circle truly hated Tallulah. Spoiler: she was their worst nightmare. We'll see the difference between Dietrich's marketable sexuality and Bankhead's dangerous honesty. And most importantly, we'll answer the question: what happens to someone who refuses to wear a mask in a world where a face is just another special effect? Forget the tales of the bad girl of Hollywood. Before you is the story of a woman who was too real for the dream factory. Act 1. Operation Caricature. How to neutralize a difficult woman. To grasp how Hollywood dismantled Tallulah Bankhead, first, let's ditch the illusion that it was accidental. We like to think stars fall due to their own demons: booze, drugs, failed romances. It's comforting to believe Tallulah faded away in empty mansions or withered in gilded cages. But that's a lie the system sells. Tallulah Bankhead didn't fall. She was pushed, methodically, coldly, with calculated cruelty. This wasn't a series of blunders. It was a special operation. A mission to turn a brilliant dramatic actress into a carnival clown. Let's rewind to the start. When Tallulah hit Hollywood after conquering the London stage, she wasn't that scandalous dame. She was a queen, daughter of the Speaker of the House, granddaughter of a senator. American political blood ran in her veins. She was educated, sharp-tongued, with a stage presence that made London critics weep with joy. Paramount didn't just hire her, They gave her a contract meant to make her the answer to Marlene Dietrich and Greta Garbo. The stakes were set for greatness. But studio bosses quickly realized their fatal mistake. They didn't buy an actress. They let a wild animal into their sterile workshop, one that refused to obey. In the studio system of the 30s, there was a clear algorithm for creating a star. A person's identity was erased, replaced by a myth. Names changed, biographies rewritten, teeth pulled and replaced, hairlines raised by electrolysis. Most importantly, a moral code was signed. You could be anyone in the bedroom, but in public, you were studio property. Tallulah Bankhead committed the unforgivable. She refused to go through this depersonalizing conveyor belt. She didn't just break the rules, she ignored their existence. The issue wasn't her drinking or her affairs with both women and men. The problem was, she did it with aristocratic nonchalance, without asking for permission. For Mayer and Hollywood's patriarchs, this wasn't just a challenge to authority, it was an economic threat. If audiences saw a star as a real, living, flawed, and complex person without the studio filter, the magic of the film business would crumble. The audience must believe in the fairy tale, and Tallulah was a documentary of chaos. So the system activated its defense protocol. If you can't silence someone, she was too famous, and can't quietly fire them, she had powerful connections in Washington. There's a third way: marginalization through caricature. Here's how it works. You take a person's most vivid, dangerous traits and crank up the volume to absurdity until they stop commanding respect and start provoking laughter. Fear of a strong woman must be transformed into mockery of a crazy one. Look at how the media began to shift the narrative around her. In the early 30s, headlines shouted about her talent, comparing her to Sarah Bernhardt. By the mid-30s, the focus shifted solely to her eccentricity. Journalists, the studio system's attack dogs, stopped writing about her acting. They started writing about her antics. The famous darling, which she used with everyone, became the first nail in the coffin of her serious career. In reality, it was a socialite's habit, a way to mask the fact that due to nearsightedness and a constant stream of people, she often didn't recognize acquaintances. It was a social shield. What did the media do? They turned it into a meme. Darling became synonymous with a drunken, promiscuous woman who couldn't remember names because her brain was fogged by gin. An aristocratic nuance twisted into a symptom of degradation. Next, her sexuality. Tallulah didn't hide that she didn't wear underwear. For her, it was a matter of comfort and personal freedom, a rebellion against the corsets and conventions of the Victorian era she grew up in. But Hollywood turned it into a dirty joke. The legendary phrase, attributed to various people but always about Tallulah, went, "I don't know who this woman is, but for God's sake, put some panties on her." Feel the difference? Marlene Dietrich in a man's suit is mysterious and stylish. Tallulah without underwear is vulgar and dirty. Though in essence, both women challenged gender norms, but Dietrich allowed herself to be packaged as a fetish. Tallulah was terrifyingly corporeal. Studios began sabotaging her filmography. This is the most cynical moment of the operation. Seeing she wouldn't be controlled, they stopped giving her roles requiring depth. They started casting her in films exploiting her scandalous image, not her acting range. They offered her roles of fallen women, hysterics, socialites with heavy fates. The system said, "Want to be bad? Fine, we'll sell you as a monster." Remember Hitchcock's Lifeboat? It's arguably her best film role. She plays journalist Connie Porter, cynical, strong, complex. She's magnificent in this film. She steals every scene. But what did the press discuss after the film's release? Not her performance. They gossiped about rumors that on set, she was again without underwear, and crew members awkwardly averted their eyes when she climbed the ladder. Even when she delivered brilliance, the propaganda machine reduced it to underwear. This wasn't an accident. This was a tactic of devaluation. You can't perceive someone as a great artist if you're made to think of them only as the butt of lewd jokes. And here we reach the most terrifying stage of Operation Caricature. Tallulah, being a smart woman, saw all this. She understood what was happening. But instead of hiding or trying to become a good girl, which was against her nature, she decided to go all in. She started playing along with the caricature. This was a tragic defense mechanism. You want to see me as a crazy clown? Fine. I'll be the loudest, drunkest, most unbearable clown you've ever seen. But I'll do it on my terms. She turned her public persona into a performance. She'd go on radio shows and say things that made censors go gray in seconds. She turned her life into a never-ending one-woman show, where she was both director and star and victim. She began selling her vices because she realized, in this town, honesty doesn't sell, but scandal pays well. But beneath the noise lay a deep professional tragedy. Tallulah Bankhead was an actress of Bette Davis's caliber. She had the same nerve, the same power. But Davis, with all her complexity, played by the industry's rules. She fought for roles, but didn't fight the system's hypocrisy. Tallulah waged war against the very air Hollywood breathed. That's why she was excluded from all lists. She didn't make it into the pantheon of great film divas, remaining in history as the one with the raspy voice. The system couldn't let her become an icon because an icon is a role model. And to emulate Tallulah would mean dismantling the very foundation of social control. The Sewing Circle, which we'll discuss next, watched this destruction in horror. For Hollywood's lesbians and bisexuals, Garbo, Hepburn, Stanwyck, Tallulah's fate became a cautionary tale. Look what happens if you speak up. See how they'll smear you, even if you're a genius. Tallulah became a scarecrow in Hollywood's moral garden. Her destruction was a signal to everyone else. Stay quiet. Whisper in your closed clubs. Wear masks. Because if you try to live with an open face, we'll turn your face into a clown mask you can't remove. She wasn't a victim of her passions. She was a victim of refusing to be ashamed of those passions. In a world where shame was the main tool of control, Tallulah's shamelessness was a revolutionary act, and the revolution was crushed, not by shooting the revolutionary, but by making them a laughingstock. By the late 40s, Operation Caricature was complete. The world forgot the great actress Tallulah Bankhead. The world only knew the character named Tallulah, a walking joke, a party toast, a radio gag. A woman who could have played Hamlet ended up playing a parody of herself on lowbrow talk shows. But beneath the layers of makeup and bravado, beneath the loud laughter that made glasses tremble, lay a truth that terrified the Sewing Circle more than the morality police. And about this truth, which made Tallulah an outcast even among her own, we must talk right now. Act 2. The antimatter of the Sewing Circle. If the first part of our tale was about how Hollywood's patriarchal machine defused Tallulah Bankhead, then the second part is far more tangled and uncomfortable. It's not about her enemies, but those who should have been her allies. We step into the realm of the Sewing Circle, a secret society that, according to modern myth, should have embraced Tallulah as their queen. But reality smashes this myth with a sledgehammer. Tallulah Bankhead wasn't an icon to the sewing circle. She was a radioactive element. She was antimatter to their carefully constructed universe. To grasp the depth of Tallulah's tragedy, we must strip away the romantic veneer from the very concept of the sewing circle. Let's be honest. The sewing circle, a term credited to the great Alla Nazimova, was never a feminist underground or a resistance headquarters. It was a mechanism of adaptation, a system of collective security built on fear. The lesbians and bisexuals of the Golden Age, from Greta Garbo to Katharine Hepburn, made an unspoken pact with the industry's devil. The terms were simple. We give you talent and box office hits, and you, the studios, pretend to believe in our heterosexuality as long as we follow the Hays Code. The key word here was follow. Members of the sewing circle were masters of encryption. Their survival depended on codes. Violets in the lapel. Pantsuits passed off as eccentric European fashion. Using male pronouns in private letters. Boston marriages. These women's lives were a virtuoso performance of duality. They created a parallel reality where everything was said in hints, glances, pauses. It was a zone of silence where a loud voice meant career death. And into this library silence, where every sound was muffled by carpets of lies, burst Tallulah Bankhead. She didn't just speak loudly, she spoke literally. Tallulah committed a crime against the very logic of the circle. She refused to use codes. In a world where love for a woman was called elevated friendship, Tallulah called things by their names, using language that would make dock workers blush. Imagine the horror of Greta Garbo, a woman who turned secrecy into a religion, who built a career on mystique. I want to be alone. Garbo knew her secret was her main asset. And then came Tallulah, who at a social event might loudly comment on someone's figure or bedroom skills, not caring who was nearby, producer, journalist, or FBI agent. To the sewing circle, Tallulah was a walking threat of exposure. Being near her was dangerous. She was like someone lighting a cigarette in a gunpowder warehouse, genuinely not understanding why everyone was so nervous. This was a fundamental difference in psychology. The sewing circle believed in separation. There was the public self and the private self. Between them, a wall. Tallulah Bankhead lived in the concept of wholeness. For her, there was no wall. She was the same in the bedroom, on set, and in the police station. And this wholeness was unbearable for those used to living in a fragmented world. Consider this conflict through the lens of Marlene Dietrich. Dietrich was also part of this world. She too loved women, she too wore pants. But Dietrich was a genius of control. She turned her androgyny into a stage product. When Dietrich kissed a woman in the film Morocco, it was art with a capital A. It was safe because it was on screen, within the script, under the spotlight. Dietrich managed her image with the precision of a surgeon. She knew where the performance ended and reality began, and never let outsiders backstage. Tallulah knew no boundaries. Her androgyny, if you can call it that, wasn't a style but an animal nature. She didn't play at being a man, she simply claimed male rights. The right to drink, to swear, to choose partners, to not apologize. Dietrich sold the illusion of vice. Tallulah offered the reality of freedom. Hollywood, and the sewing circle with it, only bought illusions. Reality scared them. Reality was dirty, unpredictable, and uncontrollable. That's why the sewing circle isolated her. It wasn't simple snobbery. It was quarantine. Women who had spent years building their glass castles of decent reputation saw Tallulah as a vandal with a stone in hand. If Tallulah got arrested or hit the papers with another scandal, the shadow would fall on everyone around her. She was the patient zero of openness, and no one wanted to catch it. Moreover, Tallulah's behavior caused deep psychological dissonance among the circle's members. She was a living reproach to their own cowardice. Looking at Tallulah, who didn't give a damn about public opinion, women like Katharine Hepburn, who hid her true nature behind the image of an asexual athlete or Spencer Tracy's loyal friend, felt a pang of conscience. Tallulah showed them what life could be like if they weren't afraid. But instead of admiring her courage, they chose a defensive reaction: contempt. It's easier to label someone vulgar, loose, and crazy than to admit they are freer than you. It's easier to say, "She's just a drunk who can't behave," than to admit, "She's the only one of us who didn't sell her soul for a contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer." Tallulah Bankhead shattered the silence pact. The sewing circle operated like the mafia, omerta. You don't talk about me, I don't talk about you. We all know who's who, but we never say it out loud in front of civilians. Tallulah didn't sign the omerta, not because she wanted to betray anyone, but because she organically didn't know how to whisper. Her voice, that famous low baritone, was made for declamation, not conspiracy. There was another reason she became anti-matter: her background. Don't forget, she was a Bankhead, daughter of Alabama's political elite. This gave her a degree of inner confidence and impunity that poor immigrants like Garbo or Dietrich didn't have. Tallulah knew that even if Hollywood threw her out, she'd remain a Bankhead. She had a safety net of family pride and connections. Others didn't have this net. Their career was all they had. So to the sewing circle, Tallulah's recklessness looked like the arrogance of a rich girl playing with fire because she knew Daddy, or his shadow, would cover for her. They hated her for being able to afford the luxury of not being afraid. In the end, Tallulah found herself in a unique and terrifying position. To the heterosexual majority, she was too queer, too strange, too masculine. But to Hollywood's queer community, she was too open, too dangerous, too real. She didn't fit into any category. She was stuck in limbo. She was rejected by normal society for her sins, and she was rejected by the underground society for how she confessed those sins, publicly and without remorse. Tallulah's tragedy in the context of the sewing circle is the tragedy of a prophet stoned by her own. She lived the life they dreamed of in their wildest fantasies, but in reality, they recoiled from her like the plague. She proved a terrifying theorem: the most unforgivable behavior in a totalitarian system, and Hollywood in the 30s was a totalitarian moral system, isn't breaking the rules. It's refusing to hide after breaking them. The sewing circle was a zone of comfortable twilight. Tallulah was a spotlight. And as you know, in a dark room, the one who turns on the light irritates everyone present. It hurts the eyes. You want to squint and ask to turn it off. And Hollywood eventually turned her off. But before we move on to how exactly she faded, we need to dissect another layer of this complex pie. We need to understand why the very nature of her personality baffled studio marketers, why she couldn't be sold as either a femme fatale or one of the guys. We move on to the anatomy of the Pandora's box she opened. Act 3. Pandora's box. Why she defied classification. Golden Age Hollywood wasn't just a dream factory, it was a colossal sorting center. Picture a massive warehouse where every person is a product to be packaged, labeled, and placed on the right shelf. The system worked flawlessly because it was binary. A woman on screen could be a saint, Mary Pickford, innocent victim, mother; a sinner, Theda Bara, vamp, seductress who either dies or repents. Later, nuances emerged. One of the guys, Carol Lombard, icy goddess; Greta Garbo, exotic siren; Marlene Dietrich. But the rule was ironclad. One actor, one role. When you bought a ticket, you knew exactly what you were getting. You don't go to a Shirley Temple film expecting a bloodbath. You don't watch Mae West for monastic humility. Tallulah Bankhead was a disaster for this logistics. She was a system glitch, a bug in the studio marketing matrix. She didn't just defy categories. She embodied contradictions. Producers saw a beautiful woman with sultry eyes, luxurious hair, and a figure made for silk. She looked like the perfect romantic heroine. Great, they thought. We'll sell her as the new icon of femininity. But the moment she opened her mouth, the illusion shattered. From this porcelain doll came a bass, not just a low voice like Bacall's, but a rumbling, smoky baritone that sounded like a truck driver fresh from a poker win. This was the first level of dissonance, an audio-visual clash. The human brain craves harmony. See an angel, expect a harp. Tallulah looked like an angel, but sounded like a trombone. For audiences in the 30s, this wasn't just odd, it was unsettling. It created a subconscious sense of threat. A woman who sounds like a man but looks like a goddess is a chimera. And in mythology, chimeras are monsters, the second level of dissonance, social paradox. America's class system wasn't as rigid as Britain's, but it existed. Tallulah was aristocracy. The Bankheads were Southern royalty. Her father was Speaker of the House, her uncle a senator. She grew up in the corridors of power. She had impeccable manners when she chose to show them. She knew which fork to use for oysters and could discuss geopolitics with Churchill. Yet her behavior was that of a dockside wench. She swore with virtuosity, filthily and creatively. She drank gin straight from the bottle. She talked about her venereal diseases like discussing the weather. For Hollywood, this was an unsolvable puzzle. How to market this hybrid? If she were just a vulgar simpleton, she could be a comedic sidekick. If she were just a haughty lady, she'd play queens and duchesses. But she was a lady who acted like a tramp. Audiences couldn't decide. Admire her or despise her? Was she above us or below us? This cognitive dissonance irritated viewers. People love stars who affirm their worldview, not shatter it every 5 minutes. The third and deepest level, gender chaos. We've mentioned the sewing circle and lesbians, but Tallulah's issue was broader than sexual orientation. It was her energy. In cinema of the time, roles were clearly divided. Men were active. They looked, acted, took. Women were passive. They were looked at, received action, seduced, or resisted. Tallulah Bankhead was aggressively active. She devoured the space around her. On screen and in life, she dominated men not with feminine wiles, but sheer willpower and intellect. She didn't flirt. She attacked. When Paramount tried to make her the second Marlene Dietrich, they failed spectacularly. Why? Because Dietrich, even in a man's suit, remained an object of desire. She was cold, detached, allowing viewers to project fantasies onto her. Dietrich was a screen. Tallulah wasn't a screen. She was a projector. She radiated such powerful energy that male audiences felt uneasy. Men in the theater felt this woman on screen was stronger than them. She didn't want them. She judged them, and the judgment was likely not in their favor. This was deadly for box office returns. In the 30s, men paid for tickets to feel like heroes. Tallulah made them feel like boys being scolded by a stern and slightly drunk governess. Studios tried to repackage her. They tried to soften her image. It looked fake, like a wolf in sheep's clothing. They tried to make her a villain, but she was too charismatic, and audiences started sympathizing with evil, breaking Hollywood's moral code. Tallulah became the embodiment of what would later be called camp, long before Susan Sontag described it. She was too much in everything, too much emotion, too many gestures, too much truth. She turned her life into a grotesque because ordinary reality cramped her. And here's the answer to why she couldn't be classified. Classification demands simplification. To file a folder, you trim the edges. Tallulah refused to be simplified. She said, "I'm as pure as the driven snow," and then added, "But I've drifted through the sewer." She spoke of her love for God and the Bible. She was indeed well read in theology, and a minute later committed a mortal sin. This wasn't hypocrisy in her view. To her, it was the fullness of life. People are complex. People are woven from contradictions. But Hollywood is a business of selling simple emotions. The Sewing Circle understood this. Katharine Hepburn understood it. On screen, she was headstrong, but ultimately submitted to a strong man, usually Cary Grant or Spencer Tracy. Garbo understood it. She died for love. Tallulah didn't submit or die. She stood in the frame, laughed her thunderous laugh, and looked straight at the camera, breaking the fourth wall just by existing. Studio bosses, faced with this phenomenon, reached the only conclusion possible for corporate logic. The product is defective. They didn't think, maybe our categories are outdated. They thought, this woman is wrong. Her inability to fit into Pandora's box became her sentence. In marketing, there's a rule. If you can't explain what it is in 3 seconds, you can't sell it. Tallulah Bankhead couldn't be explained in 3 seconds or 3 hours. She was a living Rorschach test for America. Puritans saw the devil in her. Intellectuals saw a genius of irony. The queer community saw a dangerous reflection, and studios saw red numbers in the financial reports. So when we say Tallulah was pushed out, it's not quite right. The system simply spat her out, like a complex machine ejects a part that doesn't fit by size, shape, or material. She was made of a different alloy, and here we come to the most intriguing comparison. If Tallulah was uncontrollable chaos, was there an alternative in Hollywood? Was there an example of a woman with similar settings, bisexuality, strength, independence, who managed to hack the system rather than be crushed by it? Yes, there was. And this comparison will be painful, but necessary. Marlene Dietrich. Why did one become a style legend and the other a scandal legend? What was their fundamental difference besides the amount of underwear? That's what I'll tell you next. Act 4. 2 survival models, Dietrich versus Bankhead. To truly grasp the mechanics of survival in Hollywood, we must draw the harshest comparison in 20th century showbiz history. We need to place 2 figures side by side who, at first glance, seem almost identical, yet embody 2 opposing philosophies of existence. In the left corner of the ring, Tallulah Bankhead, In the right corner, Marlene Dietrich. Why is this comparison inevitable? Because their starting points were strikingly similar. Both had deep, hypnotic voices. Both were bisexual, known for their affairs with women. Both scorned the traditional role of the housewife. Both wore pants when it could get you arrested for impersonating a man. Both were style icons. Yet their life outcomes were polar opposites. Marlene Dietrich died a deity, wrapped in a myth she crafted herself. She remains a symbol of elegant rebellion. Tallulah Bankhead died as a tabloid heroine, her name synonymous with chaos. What's the difference? Why did the system canonize one and crucify the other? The answer lies in one word: control. Marlene Dietrich wasn't just an actress. She engineered her image. She technologist of her fame. Dietrich understood Hollywood's cardinal rule: reality is dull. Only illusion sells. Everything Dietrich did was a calculated performance. Her rebellion was meticulously staged. Remember her famous tuxedo in the film Morocco, 1930. She walks on stage in tails, sings a song, then kisses a woman in the audience. It was a shock. It was a scandal. But it was an aesthetic scandal. Dietrich presented lesbian subtext as high art. She did it within the frame, under perfect lighting. She knew how to light her cheekbones better than most cinematographers, in a flawlessly tailored suit. Dietrich turned her sexuality into an exotic commodity. She told the audience, "Look, I'm playing a man. Isn't it mysterious? Isn't it stylish?" She created a safe distance between herself and the audience. The viewer understood. This is cinema. This is a game. This is European chic. Now look at Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah didn't play a man or wear a tuxedo as a stage costume. She wore men's clothes because she felt comfortable in them at the cottage or at a party. When Tallulah kissed women or men, she didn't do it under spotlights to create a beautiful picture. She did it because she wanted to. The difference between them is the difference between erotica and pornography, in a philosophical sense. Dietrich is erotica, a hint, a veil, a play of shadows, a promise of mystery. Bankhead is the pornography of reality. Everything on display, unfiltered, with sweat, the smell of alcohol, and foul language. Hollywood adores erotica because it's safe. Erotica leaves room for fantasy. Hollywood hates the pornography of reality because it kills the magic. It's too raw. Dietrich understood that a star isn't a person, it's an object, and she polished that object her entire life. She was the ultimate professional of discipline. She arrived on set on time, knew her lines, knew her partner's lines, knew where the camera stood. She was a soldier of the industry. Her sewing circle was an exclusive elite club, entry by invitation only. She guarded her private life with the ferocity of a Cerberus, creating an information vacuum the public filled with admiration. Tallulah Bankhead was anti-discipline. For her, life and stage were a single stream of consciousness. She didn't separate. Here I work, here I live. She played 24/7, but she played herself. She could disrupt a shoot because she was hungover. She could argue with a director because he was an idiot. She could tell a reporter something that made studio PR agents want to hang themselves. Tallulah made the fatal mistake. She made herself accessible. Dietrich was an untouchable goddess on a pedestal. To see her, you had to look up. Tallulah was the woman sitting with you at the bar, telling a dirty joke. She came down to the audience's level. And when a deity descends into the crowd stops praying and starts getting chummy. That's why Tallulah became funny. Laughter is a reaction to what we don't respect or fear. No one laughed at Dietrich. They might have feared her, hated her, but they didn't laugh at her. She was too majestic. Tallulah let the public see her seams, her cracks, her vulnerability. Consider their approach to aging. It's also part of the survival strategy. Dietrich fought time as a personal enemy. Lifts, the famous lifting tapes hidden under a wig. Strict diet, light control. When she realized she could no longer maintain the illusion of eternal youth, she simply vanished. She locked herself in her Paris apartment and didn't appear in public for the last 12 years of her life. She wanted the world to remember her as perfect. She protected the brand to her last breath. Tallulah aged in front of everyone. She didn't hide her wrinkles, her bags under her eyes, her trembling hands. On the contrary, she made her decay part of the show. In her later years, she starred in horror films, like Die, Die, My Darling, playing old madwomen. She allowed the public to witness the decay. For Hollywood, it was repulsive. It was a breach of contract. We pay you for beauty, and you show us death. But for art history, Tallulah's act was one of incredible honesty. She said, "Look, this is what time does. This is what life does. I won't hide." Dietrich survived because she became a symbol. Symbols don't bleed. Symbols don't get drunk. Symbols don't err. Bankhead perished, career-wise, because she remained human. There's another, subtler aspect: queer coding. Marlene Dietrich used her bisexuality as a tool of power over men. Her message was, "I'm so good, I don't need men, I'm self-sufficient." It excited men because it was a challenge they wanted to take on. Tallulah Bankhead used her sexuality as a tool of freedom. Her message was, "I'll sleep with whoever I want, and I don't care what you think." It scared men because there was no game they could win. She didn't challenge them. She simply ignored their rules. In the end, we have two models. Dietrich's model, adaptation through sublimation. Take your wrongness, wrap it in gold, call it art, keep your distance. Never tell the truth if a beautiful lie works better. Result: eternal fame, legendary status, but complete loneliness in the golden cage of your own myth. Bankhead's model, confrontation through openness. Throw your wrongness in their face. Reject the packaging. Tell the truth, even if it's ugly. Laugh the loudest. Result: reputation as a scandalous figure, career failures, but absolute inner freedom, paid for at a terrible price. Hollywood, the great liar, chose Dietrich. It said, "Be like Marlene, code beautifully." The sewing circle chose Dietrich. They said, "She knows how to keep secrets." Tallulah was left alone, not because she was worse, but because she was a mirror without a frame. Everyone who tried to hold it got cut on its sharp edges. And this leads us to the final act. What happens to a person who rejects both major currencies of society, hypocrisy and conformity? How does the story end for a woman who chose to live life without retakes, live on air, without a safety net? We're approaching the climax. To the moment when the laughter dies down and all that's left is the deafening silence of an empty room. Act 5. Solitude in an empty room. In every great play, there's a moment when the set dismantles, the audience disperses, and the actor stands alone on an empty stage. The lights fade, leaving only the echo of footsteps. For Tallulah Bankhead, this fifth act stretched over the last 2 decades of her life. This was the cruelest, yet most honest part of her story. Here, in the finale, we find the ultimate answer to the question, what's the price of absolute freedom in a world built on pretense? We're used to the cliched endings of cursed stars, faded away in empty mansions, oblivion, poverty, death in a pool of their own despair. It's a trope tabloids feed us to make us feel better about our safe, dull normalcy. Look, society tells us, this is what happens to those who live too brightly. But Tallulah Bankhead's end isn't a tale of downfall. It's a story of isolation taken to the extreme. It's about how a person's intensity can scorch the space around them. By the 50s, Tallulah had become an institution. She was famous for being famous. People tuned in to her big show, not for the guests, but to hear Tallulah tear them apart. She was a national attraction. Tourists in New York dreamed of seeing the Statue of Liberty and Tallulah Bankhead, preferably in the same monumental state. But behind the closed doors of her East 62nd Street apartment, there was a deafening silence. Why was she alone? Not because friends abandoned her. She had hundreds of acquaintances. Her phone never stopped ringing. Her home was a revolving door for gay men, young actors, jazz musicians, and random drifters. The tragedy lay in the quality of this company. The sewing circle, those women who could have understood her, shared the burden of living with or without a mask, had long distanced themselves. For Garbo, Hepburn, or Crawford, associating with Tallulah in the 50s was reputational suicide. Tallulah had become too grotesque, too unpredictable. They, who preserved their capital and faces through surgery and silence, saw Tallulah as a living reminder of death and decay. She was the portrait of Dorian Gray they hid in the attic. Only this portrait walked the streets and gave interviews. Tallulah's circle in her later years mostly consisted of what Hollywood called caddies, hangers-on. These were people who fed off her energy, her money, and her fame. They laughed at her jokes, poured her bourbon, and endured her outbursts because life next to her seemed like a Technicolor movie. But it wasn't friendship. It was a symbiosis of parasite and host. Tallulah knew this. Her intellect, that sharp knife she never sheathed, remained intact. She knew she played the queen before a court of jesters, and this understanding made her loneliness unbearable. There's nothing worse than being the smartest person in a room full of people you pay to be there. Her physical decline also became a public act. Emphysema, the result of smoking 100 cigarettes a day for half a century, turned every breath into a battle. But even here, she refused pity. She didn't play the poor, sick old lady. When asked about her health, she replied with gallows humor. She turned her cough into part of her performance. She wore her ravaged body not like rags, but like battle scars. Unlike Marlene Dietrich, who walled herself up in a Paris apartment so no one would see her age, Tallulah kept stepping onto the stage. She starred in the trash horror Die, Die, My Darling in 1965. Critics spat. "The great Bankhead has sunk to cheap horror flicks," screamed the papers. But if you look without snobbery, you'll see an act of incredible courage. She knew she looked terrible. She knew the script was trash. But she kept working. Why? Because work was the only place she felt alive. She preferred to be a funny monster on screen than a beautiful corpse in memory. It was her final middle finger to an industry obsessed with youth. In this late period, there's an episode that perfectly captures her essence. During the filming of that horror movie, producers tried to make her soften a line. Tallulah, barely standing, rasping, dying, threw a 3-hour fit. She defended the character's truth. In a trash film everyone considered garbage, she fought for artistic integrity as if she were acting in Chekhov. Because for her, there were no small roles or hack jobs. There was only the truth of the moment. She couldn't work half-heartedly, even when standing at the grave's edge. The final chord sounded in December 1968. Asian flu, complicated by emphysema. St. Luke's Hospital. Usually the last words of great people are mythologized. They say they repented or saw the light. Tallulah Bankhead stayed true to herself to the very end. Legend has it her last coherent words were, codeine, bourbon. Some see this as proof of her depravity. Look, she died asking for drugs and alcohol, but let's look deeper. In these words is a refusal to pretend. She was in pain, she was scared, and she asked for what would ease the pain without pretending to be a saint. She didn't ask for a priest. She didn't ask for God's forgiveness. She always believed she and God had their own special relationship based on mutual respect for strong personalities. She asked for pain relief. It was ultimate biological honesty. The body's reality against the soul's expectations. When she died, Hollywood sighed in relief. The source of noise was silenced. The sewing circle could sleep easy. No one would drag their skeletons out of the closet anymore. Thousands attended her funeral, but few truly knew her. Fans came, journalists came. Those same parasites came. Her real colleagues, Hollywood's great liars, sent beautiful wreaths. Flowers are so safe. They don't say too much. What do we have in the end? Tallulah Bankhead died at 66. She left behind a chaotic filmography, a few brilliant theater roles none of us have seen, and a million anecdotes. It seems the system won. It turned the threat into folklore. But time is a strange thing. It erases the gilding and leaves only the supporting structures. Half a century later, we look at Marlene Dietrich and see a beautiful, cold picture. We admire the form, but feel no warmth. We look at the sewing circle and see a group of frightened women who spent their lives building shelters. And then we look at Tallulah, at her wild eyes, her dishevelment, her refusal to be convenient. And suddenly we realize she was the only one truly alive in this wax museum. Her solitude in an empty room was the price she paid for not selling her soul in pieces. She showed us what happens when a woman refuses to sew, to create comfort, hide seams, patch holes in reality. When a woman drops the needle and thread and picks up a microphone, the world tries to destroy her. The world can take her career. It can take her reputation. It can take her health. But the world couldn't take Tallulah Bankhead's voice. Even now, decades later, if you listen closely to the silence of Hollywood history, you can hear that low, smoky laugh that makes the crystal chandeliers of hypocrisy tremble. Darling, if you have no enemies, you have no character. She died alone, but she died herself. And in an industry trading in other people's faces, that's the greatest victory possible. Now that we've walked this path, from the dazzling beginning through the system's grinder to the quiet yet proud finale, we have only to draw a conclusion. To make the very point that will overturn your understanding of why we told this story at all. We began this conversation with a myth, a pretty tale that Tallulah Bankhead was a queer underground icon, the soul of the sewing circle, and just a fun-loving woman who liked to drink. Now you know the truth, and this truth is far more uncomfortable than any Hollywood script. Tallulah Bankhead wasn't part of the circle. She was the inconvenient reality the circle tried to shield itself from with velvet curtains. In film history, she played the role of the canary in the coal mine. You know why miners took a birdcage with them? If the canary stopped singing and dropped dead, it meant the air was poisoned, and everyone else needed to run. Tallulah never stopped singing. She screamed until her last breath, but her fate showed everyone else, Garbo, Hepburn, Stanwyck, that the air in Hollywood was indeed poisoned. That the price for honesty isn't just dismissal, it's becoming a laughingstock. Today we live in a world strangely reminiscent of that era. Yes, we don't have the Hays Code, but we have personal brands. We have social media, where everyone is their own Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer studio, where we retouch our lives, filter our thoughts, and desperately fear cancellation. We're all a bit part of our global sewing circle, where the main rule is to appear successful, proper, and happy. And that's why Tallulah Bankhead's story hits harder today than 50 years ago. She reminds us of the difference between reputation and character. Reputation is what others think of you. It's a fragile vase you carry through life, afraid to drop. Marlene Dietrich died with an impeccable reputation. Character is who you are when no one is watching, or when everyone is and you don't care. Tallulah Bankhead died with a terrible reputation, but with an absolute monolithic character. The sewing circle was a way to silence women, offering them safety in return. Tallulah Bankhead is an example of what happens when a woman refuses to sew, drops the hoop, and starts to speak. Yes, her life was chaos. Yes, her end was lonely. But unlike many of her contemporaries, who died suffocating in the corsets of their own lies, Tallulah Bankhead died breathing deeply, even if those lungs were destroyed by tobacco. She didn't leave behind an acting school. She didn't leave a foundation. She left behind one simple yet terrifying question that now hangs in the air before each of us. How much of your true self are you willing to cut off to fit into someone else's box? Tallulah answered, "Not an inch." And she paid for it with everything she had. Looking at her story without rose-colored glasses, we realize perhaps she was the only mentally healthy person in the madhouse we call the golden age of Hollywood. But there's another side to this coin. We've seen what happens to a woman who screams, but we've only touched on those who chose silence. Tallulah was noise. But silence kills just as effectively. It just doesn't leave bruises on the outside. It burns from within. Do you think Greta Garbo or Marlene Dietrich won this battle because they kept their fame? You're wrong. If Tallulah burned in the fire, these women slowly froze in the ice of their own control. To understand the full picture of this tragedy, you need to know the story of Greta Garbo. A woman who took the art of the sewing circle to the extreme and ultimately became its main prisoner. Why did the most desired woman on the planet at 36 close the door forever and spend the next 50 years hiding from people in dark glasses? Click on the next video to uncover the mystery of Greta Garbo. Because if Tallulah is an explosion, Garbo is a black hole. And you need to see both abysses to understand the true horror of that era.